Well, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. We'll start promptly. We won't go on West Cork time. I'm delighted to welcome you here. My name's Danielle O'Donovan and I'm a member of the committee of the West Cork History Festival, said in true West Cork fashion as well. Committee is how you say it, just in case you're asking for anyone. It is a great pleasure to be chairing this session today, which is going to cast light on the Earls of Cork. And our first speaker is David Edwards. David is a senior lecturer in history in University College Cork, and he's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, and he went to UCC in 1993 teaching and researching in the area of late medieval and early modern Ireland. On a one-year contract. Has it been rolling? It's one of those indefinite duration at the stage for sure. His current principal project focuses on the career and the estate of the new English adventurer Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, whose land-grabbing activities in Munster and parts of Connacht and Leinster helped to transform the social and economic life of early 17th century Ireland. And so it's a very great pleasure to introduce him, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bessie, for that. Okay, just first of all, this talk, it all spans, basically it all comes from a successful application years ago for funding from the Irish Research Council for a sort of study of the Boyle estates, the estates that were assembled by Richard Boyle, who later became first Earl of Cork. He assembled the estates in Ireland from the early 1590s right through to his death in 1643. Even while the war was going on in Ireland after the 1641 Rising, he was still buying land just after the Irish Rising. So he's very active in the Irish land market from the early 1590s for nearly 50 years until the early 1640s. The importance of Boyle's estates: he was the biggest landowner in Ireland by the time he died in 1643. He was also reputed to be the wealthiest subject of the crown, not just in Ireland, but in England and Scotland too. He was reputed to be the wealthiest man in the three kingdoms. How much money he actually made is something that we're trying to basically try to discover. But what our main focus with the Irish Research Council project was to chart the growth of Boyle's land holdings. Because here we have in Richard Boyle the archetypal New English colonialist. He arrives in Ireland according to his own memoirs. He wrote 4 versions of his memoir in the 1620s and early 1630s. And in them he always says one thing: how little money he had when he started. And when he arrived in Ireland in 1588, when the Spanish Armada was heading towards England, Richard Boyle left England and came to Ireland. And he basically arrived in Ireland in June 1588, and he tells us in his memoir that when he arrived he had £27 and 3 shillings, and that's all he had. He also had a very fine suit of clothes and a big hat with a pearl on the top, apparently, anyway, which he got from his mother. But anyway, that's what he tells us in his memoir. So he starts with £27, 3 shillings. He's a very young man when he arrives in Ireland. He arrives, he's basically 22 years old. And he gets a job a couple of years later as deputy escheator. And that means he's going to work for a branch of the Exchequer, and he's going to be looking into lands and land revenues that belong to the English crown in Ireland, which means he's going to be a snooper. It's his job to investigate what people own, and if they're paying their proper rents to the crown, what title they have to the lands that they own, etc. And he got that job in 1590 when he was barely 24 years old. And he was deputy escheator of the entire country, which I think is quite significant. 24 years old, and he's going to start snooping into all the land holdings in Ireland. Clearly, to get that job, he had to have connections, and we'll be coming back to that later on in the talk, because Richard Boyle did have connections. However, back to the start, arrives in Ireland, June 1588, £27, 3 shillings to his name. When he died in 1643, he owned lands in 17 counties. He had around 40 castles, numerous manors. He was the biggest landowner in the Munster plantation. By the time he died in 1643, he owned 6 plantation seigneuries, the big blocks of land into which the Munster plantation had been divided. And he also had various other sources of income, from mining and iron manufacture, which Colin Rinn, my colleague from archaeology, is the big expert on. He was also getting money from trade and from various sources. So he became, reputedly, the wealthiest subject of the crown anywhere in the Three Kingdoms. He married his children off into not necessarily the uppermost echelons of the English aristocracy, but certainly among the higher echelons of the English aristocracy. He is an upstart, is how he was viewed, because Boyle was born in Canterbury in October 1566.
You're going in and out your voice.
Okay. He's born in Canterbury in October 1566, raised in the little village of Faversham, which is about a mile outside Canterbury. And the important thing about Boyle, and this was always used against him by his enemies, was that Richard Boyle was not a gentleman born. Richard Boyle was the son of a yeoman. His father, Roger Boyle, was a yeoman farmer in Kent, in and around and basically Canterbury, who seems to have made a reasonably good marriage to the granddaughter of quite a senior figure in the town. But Boyle, nonetheless, was a yeoman's son. And in the strict social hierarchy of early modern England, that mattered. He didn't have a proper family background, he didn't have a pedigree, he didn't have a proper genealogy, and so on. Later on in life, when he's very, very successful, Boyle is very anxious to cover up his relatively humble social origins. And he recruited a sort of research team in England to go and find his gentry ancestors, because he was convinced that his family were of gentry stock. But they never found any evidence. So he was a yeoman's son, and this is used against him all the time. And people tend to react to Boyle's success as he gets richer and richer and buys more and more, going into the 1600s. They look down their noses at him, they treat him as a social upstart, and it's something that he always struggled with until he died in 1643. Okay, just to go back to the previous image, you get a sense here of where much of the lands are distributed that he buys in the course of his lifetime. So, use this little pointer thing. And he has some land up there in North Connacht in Mayo, along the coastline there. He had other lands as well, but it's very hard to find the evidence for his Connacht estates. There are reasons for that, which we'll be coming to in a few minutes. And then when you come down into Limerick and into County Clare and so on, that's when it all starts to bunch up. Basically in sort of West Kerry, out towards the Skelligs, he has a lot of land there. And then as you come all along the coast, if you just follow along the coastline of like West Cork all the way into East Cork and into County Waterford, the cluster of properties that he has. And this is a very, obviously, there's a kind of plan behind this. He's buying coastal territory. He's controlling large parts of the coastline. That's quite significant. But then also there's the Blackwater River Valley, where Waterford and Cork meet, and the area around Youghal and Lismore, and that's where you have the densest concentration of his properties. And that's where the sort of real hub of his plantation world is. And then, of course, he also has some land in Dublin. Sorry, now. There we go. Now, the project that we've been working on, we've been trying to literally count all the purchases, all the acquisitions of land that Richard Boyle made. My main research assistant on the project, basically Dr. David Heffernan, got lumbered with that task for the best part of 2 years. And between his work and my own work since, we now have a 320-page list of all the different acquisitions that he made. It's massive. It's just absolutely massive. And it's not everything. It's not everything, because some of the lands that he acquired, especially early in basically in his career, he acquired surreptitiously. You might even say illegally. He's a land grabber. He has a reputation as being a land grabber, and it's well justified. And some of those lands he may have granted to one of his sons, possibly Francis or Roger, who later becomes Earl of Orrery. But we don't have their estate books and their estate papers, so we're not quite sure of some of his lands. But we have a 320-page listing of all the other lands that he acquired during his lifetime. Now, while the project was very much focused on the acquisition, the getting of land, and then what he did with the land, how he peopled the land, what tenants he brought in, and also how much he actually got from it, how he exploited those lands. There's a lot of other questions about Boyle, leading questions about Boyle, that we've needed to deal with. So one of the key questions, given that he begins his land purchasing career early in the 1590s, shortly after he became Escheator General, or Deputy Escheator General of Ireland, is how did he make the money in the 1590s, in his early career, as a government official? I should explain this. As Deputy Escheator General, Boyle's official salary, his take-home pay, according to the official records, was £20 sterling a year. He was entitled to a few perks, free meals and free board and so on. When he travelled around, he could claim expenses. But £20 a year was what? Now, £20 a year in 1590 or 1592, it would be maybe the wages of two labourers, basically two labourers' wages. That's how much. He's been paid as much as two labourers would be paid in a year. It's not a lot of money. It's not a lot of money. And yet we know that in the 1590s, he's starting to buy land. So the big question is, where is he making the money? How is he making the money? I'll be coming back to that. That's a leading question. And it was really important, particularly for me, to try and explain Boyle's success, his extraordinary level of success that he has, buying, for example, the estates of Walter Raleigh, the biggest planter in the Munster plantation. Boyle bought Raleigh's estates for cash money. But he put down £500 in a bag on a table, and then he sent another bag of £500 a few months later, and he took the biggest plantation estate in the country, down near basically Lismore and Youghal, in the sort of Blackmore River Valley. Where do you get that money? On £20 a year, right? You know where I'm going with this, yeah? You know where I'm going with this. All right. Now, that's one thing. Okay, so there's questions about how he made his money and how he was able to buy all the stuff he bought. There's also then questions about what sort of a planter was he? Because he's often represented in the history books as the model planter. And he tried to present himself as the model planter. He was the ideal English planter in Ireland. He did everything according to basically the rules of being a planter. He was the textbook planter. Was he? Was he really? That's one of the questions that's been haunting us as we go through. And what actually is it to be, what does it really mean to be a planter in early 17th century Ireland? And our study of Boyle is really starting to turn up that. As a sort of, it needs a lot of careful examination. And then something else about Boyle is that the lands he bought, by whatever means he bought them, whatever means he acquired them, did he actually have real, safe, full legal ownership all through his career? That's something else we'll be coming back to. All right? All right, then. Follow the money. Let's follow the money. So, Boyle is Deputy Escheator General. As I said, he's a snooper. And he gets together with another snooper. He's Deputy Escheator General. He pals up with a man called Francis Capstock, who's the Deputy Surveyor General. Now, the Escheator investigates lands and land title and land revenues, crown rents, monies coming to the crown, making sure that the crown's getting its it's due, and then the escheator is supposed to report to the exchequer. The surveyor is the man in charge of releasing crown leases, crown grants of land in Ireland, setting the terms, describing the properties, saying how extensive they are, and determining what the crown rent is. Now, Francis Copstock, Deputy Surveyor General, was very well connected. He was a nephew of the Lord Deputy in the early 1590s, a man called Sir William Fitzwilliam. And those of you who know your late Tudor history and the history of the 9 Years' War and so on will know that Sir William Fitzwilliam was the Lord Deputy when the 9 Years' War began in 1594. Some historians would argue that he largely provoked the 9 Years' War by some of his antics in Ulster. But the one thing that everybody agrees on about Sir William Fitzwilliam was that he was probably the most corrupt governor in 16th century Ireland. He's the one who took the most, who lined his pockets over and over again. He saw the job of the Lord Deputy as an opportunity to get rich, or in his case, an opportunity to pay off all the debts that his family had actually accrued in Northamptonshire earlier in the 16th century. When he arrived as Lord Deputy in 1588, his family was still burdened basically with debt. So he turned the Viceroyalty in Ireland into a sort of money-making racket. And Francis Copstock is one of his people. He's his nephew, and he's made Deputy Surveyor General in charge of setting the valuation on Crown rents and the terms on which basically sort of Crown grants of land are actually issued. And Copstock pals up with Richard Boyle, who investigates lands. And this all comes to a head around what historians refer to as the concealments business. Now, you've got to think about what was the 16th century in Ireland. Largely, it's remembered correctly as a time of conflict and mounting conflict in Ireland. We have numerous rebellions. The Kildare Rebellion, 1534, Geraldine League, late 1530s. We have the sort of Midlands uprisings in the 1540s. Shane O'Neill's rising, James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald Rebellion, 1569, the Butler Revolt, the Burke Rebellion. We have the Desmond Rebellion of 1579. We have the O'Moore Rebellions. We have rebellions, war, war, war. That is not an ideal situation for the management of a Crown estate. But it is an ideal situation for land grabbing. Land title is thrown into chaos in the 16th century. Who owned what? Whether some Irish land-owning family held the land properly, lawfully, as dutiful subjects of the Crown, or whether they'd actually been in rebellion, or their father had been in rebellion. Did that affect how they owned the land? Were they actually occupying land that really belonged to the town, basically to the Crown, because of attainder, because of treason? All of these questions are up in the air. There's a massive amount of uncertainty. Means there's a business. There's a business in finding land that belongs to the Crown, anywhere, and then also the business of leasing that land out. And a lot of the lands are called concealed lands. There are numerous examples and that are known, and there are doubtless far more examples that aren't known, of families, for example, in the 1580s, living on their family estate that their family had had for generations, but an uncle or a father or a brother had been drawn into a rebellion in the previous 10 or 15 years. Their title to that land is affected. But because of the chaos, because of the wars, because of the rebellions and so on, the government does not control large parts of the country. Those lands remain with the family that had been in rebellion, is now at peace, and suddenly there's a knock on the door. And on the door is Richard Boyle and some of his henchmen. And he always had henchmen. And they say, we're here to investigate your land. So Boyle accumulates information about estates all over Ireland from 1590 onwards. He then brings the information to Francis Copstock, and they determine what the value of the land is. This works two ways. First of all, you can have your land seized by Boyle, recorded by Boyle, and then he goes to Capstock, and subsequently a crown grant is issued, and your land is gone, and basically somebody else comes in, or else you can do a deal. You can say to Boyle, look, what's it worth for you to just go away? I'll stay here, I'll say nothing, I didn't see you, you didn't see me. What do you want? And deals are done. The other way it works is lands are seized by Boyle. He holds courts of inquisition, is what they call them. And the lands then are recorded, and he goes to Capstock. And then people who are looking for land in Ireland, crown servitors, soldiers, government officials of all types, adventurers who arrive in Ireland, they haven't been paid in England, they turn up in Ireland looking to get paid, and they're looking for a grant of land in Ireland to pay the bill, right? So they will then go and have to talk to Capstock and say, right, what lands are available? Well, Capstock might tell them, or Capstock might not tell them. And what we do know is that there's a number of people become quite disgruntled. By 1593, 1594, there are rumours, and those rumours grow to complaints. And then official complaints are lodged against Capstock and Boyle for trying to manipulate the Crown estate in Ireland, and that you could only get a grant of Crown land if you offered them a kickback or if you offered them part of what they were going to be granted. The concealment's business. The officials are on the take. It's white-collar crime. It's basically the only real loser in this is the Crown, and perhaps the unfortunate natives who hadn't done a deal. So there's two real sources of like sort of victim in it as well. But the Crown is the one that is the single biggest loser in that it was estimated that there were 69 courts of inquiry that Boyle had held that had never led to land grants. And the actual valuation on those lands was at least 8,000 a year. To get a sense of how much that is, you need to think about maybe 4 or 5 million in like modern terms. It's a lot of money. And he's sitting on it. And then he's distributing the land among his friends. Now this is the other thing, is Boyle and Capstock could not have done what they did without facilitators. I already said Capstock was a nephew of the Lord Deputy, Sir William Fitzwilliam. Boyle is protected by the escheator, John Crofton. He's also protected by a man called Sir Anthony St. Leger, who becomes the Master of the Rolls, one of the leading judges in Ireland, and who's in charge of the Crown estate in Ireland and the granting of land in Ireland. And Boyle and him are very, very close friends, because they're both from Kent. There's a sort of Kentish mafia in Dublin in the 1590s. Sir George Carew was another one of them. He was the Master of the Ordnance, and he was also one of Boyle's patrons from the 1590s onwards, and we'll come across him again later. This doesn't mean that Boyle got away with it. The complaints had to be acted upon. Fitzwilliam was sacked in 1594 when Elizabeth I realised how much money she'd probably lost through his agency, or misagency. But as soon as Fitzwilliam is replaced, there are investigations into Crown revenues in Ireland, and Boyle and Capstock are arrested. And Capstock doesn't go to prison, because after all, he's a viceroy's nephew. But Boyle does go to prison, because he's a yeoman's son. So Boyle goes to prison, and he goes to prison for the first time around May or June 1594, and he's in prison. He's imprisoned in Dublin, not once, not twice, not 3 times, 6 times between basically May 1594 and March 1598. He's in and out. He's basically in and out of prison all the time. All his investigations go on and on into the concealment business. But he carries on. And one of the things is that while he's in prison, this is one of the most interesting things that's come up from the work that we've done, is while he's in jail, he buys all these things. So he buys Ballynorey, County Galway. It's not in Scotland. He buys Morgan's in County Limerick. He buys Bealach Castle in County Mayo. He buys Ballycullenna. He buys lands in Sligo and Leitrim. He buys Earl Abbey in County Kerry, otherwise known as Muckross Abbey. He gets his hands on that in February 1596. He doesn't buy it directly. He buys it through a third party who buys it and then gives it to him basically the following day. That's how he operated, through third parties, through fronts. September 1596, he gets lands in Waterford, Limerick, Queen's County or Laois, and Roscommon. 1597, a whole load of rectories in County Tipperary, about 14 of them. And in December 1597, he does a series of negotiations with the Protestant fellows at Trinity College, Dublin, who can't get access to lands they've been granted by the Crown because Boyle, although he's in prison, his family are blocking access to those lands. And the heavy squad are out making sure that the fellows of the like Trinity can't get access to the tenants to find out and so on. He's in jail. He's buying all this stuff. These are the ones we know about. There are other lands as well that we don't know about. You have a sense of how much he got, basically a few years later, when lands that there's no record of suddenly turn up as his, when he gets them all laundered in 1605 and 1606. That's the first white-collar scheme. How much money he made out of that is hard to tell. The Crown reckoned it had lost at least 8,000 or 9,000 a year through Boyle's antics during the early 1590s, 1590 through to 1594. He's sacked as Estuator General. It doesn't matter, as Deputy Estuator General. The new Deputy Estuator is a friend of his, and the business just carries on. The second scheme is in 1600, in the next incarnation in Boyle's career, when Boyle is made Clerk of the Council of Munster. Sounds a very innocuous job. Someone sitting down at his desk, just scribbling away as the clerk. The Clerk of the Council of Munster was a really important job in Munster. He is the Lord President of Munster's right-hand man. He is the go-to guy. If you want to talk to the Lord President, if you want a favour from the Lord President, if you want the Lord President to call off his forces, you go to the clerk and the clerk gets to the Lord President. The Lord President, by the way, was Sir George Carew, one of Boyle's earlier patrons. Also as Clerk of the Munster Council, Boyle is spy master. He's the guy who collects information for the Lord President. And it's wartime. He's appointed in 1600. He arrives a couple of months after he's appointed with Carew. And by 1601, it's time for the Battle of Kinsale, the sort of climactic moment in the 9 Years' War. The Spanish invaders at Kinsale, Tyrone and O'Donnell's forces coming down from Ulster to try and basically link up with them, and an English army spreading out across large parts of County Cork and so on to try and block off this like meeting of two enemy forces. Boyle's there as the Clerk of the Council of Munster. And Boyle is making money. And he's making serious money. Probably far more than he made as Deputy Estuator, because of army pay. The usual army for Elizabethan Ireland is maybe around 2,500, sometimes 3,000 soldiers. At the time of the Battle of Kinsale, the English force in Ireland was 17,500, much bigger than usual. Every one of those 17,500 soldiers needed to be paid. And the pay came in treasure ships. The treasure ships would arrive in Waterford or Dublin, would then be collected by officials, and then Boyle, as Clerk of the Munster Council, would take charge of the treasure, and the captains would have to come to him to get their pay. And there could have been trouble on the high seas. All the treasure may not have been loaded on the ships. Some of it may have been lost. No one really knows. But Boyle would tell them, look, we're a bit short of money. Do you want to be paid? Yeah. Okay, I'll pay you 75% of what you're due if you give me a receipt for the 100%. Okay, the actual force in Munster at the time of the Battle of Kinsale was 7,800 soldiers. There are 7,800 pay slips. And Boyle has a 25% stake in a lot of that money. Okay? He and his friends. So he made an absolute fortune. We know about this because of one key document that turned up. That's it there. And it's an arrangement between the paymaster in Dublin, a man called Peter Bolton, who was related to Lord Chancellor Bolton, actually, and Boyle. And Bolton writes to Boyle, and he names 25 captains, this is immediately after the Battle of Kinsale, who are to give allowance to Boyle. They're to give the 25%. That is specified in basically in an earlier part of the document. And there they all are actually named, right, including the Earl of Kildare, Garrett the Fat, one of my favourite Earls of Kildare, Sir Oliver Lambert, Sir Oliver St John. A lot of these people went on to become really significant people in early 17th century Ireland. You're actually looking at, in many ways, the core of the government of Jacobean Ireland are on this list of guys who've done deals with Boyle, right? Okay, that's important to understand. But that is how he bought Lismore Castle. That's how he had the £500 in a bag, dumps it on the table and says to Raleigh, "You're broke, there's 500 quid. You going to sell me that?" And Raleigh says yes. Raleigh agreed to sell Lismore the plantation seigneury that he owned, all the lands he owned basically in Munster, for £1,500. And it's on the 7th of December 1602 that the actual deal is done. He gets £500 in December, he gets £500 in March, and then Raleigh gets into trouble in the summer of 1603, and Boyle didn't pay the final 500. So there we go. Anyway, so, all right, lands are starting to accumulate. Let's just cut straight to the chase. Is he a model planter? There's numerous ways of looking at that. He takes over Raleigh's estate, and he's very scrupulous when he has Raleigh's estate to adhere to the Plantation Articles of 1586, the basis on which plantation lands were given to planters in Ireland. And he had to undertake that all of his tenants would be English or of English blood, which allowed in Old English, the Anglo-Irish, as well as in as like New English, basically new settlers. And he is very scrupulous about ensuring that his estates in the sort of Blackwater River Valley, in the Inchiquin scenery, in Raleigh's lands, that the vast majority of the tenants on those lands were English, and some of them were Old English, but they all had English descent, they all had English blood. He's very, very careful about that. But they aren't the only plantation estates he buys. He also gets his hands on Ballymacdonald in County Kerry, down near Dunquin and Smerrick and so on. And how he gets that, I haven't got time to go into, but it's also quite a story. But he gets his hands on that. And that particular estate, the tenants are nearly all Gaelic, or else they're Old English, and they are 100% Catholics. Because one of the key plantation articles was that he would maintain the Protestant religion. He does that on the Raleigh lands. He doesn't do it on other plantation lands. One of the reasons he is able to do this, I assume, is that the Kerry lands, Kerry itself was very lightly governed in the early 17th century. There was very little sort of government present in Kerry. So he was able to do more or less what he wanted in Kerry, whereas in Cork and Waterford there's a very strong English government and growing English government presence. So the plantations are being observed, they're being, the movements of tenants and so on is being watched and monitored. Less so in Kerry. So Kerry seems to be a very different place. It's almost like an Irish plantation. It's supposed to be an English plantation, but it's actually nearly all Irish people, Old English Irish and Gaelic Irish, living on those lands as Boyle's tenants. Then there's the non-plantation lands that he buys. He buys lands throughout Munster, in West Cork, in Limerick and so on, where how he actually tenants those lands, the estate records show again, it isn't even 50-50 English-Irish. It's more like 60-40 Irish-English tenants on the non-plantation lands. So he's a model planter where he needs to be a model planter, where it's necessary, and then where he doesn't have to be a model planter. He's just a landlord looking for tenants, and he doesn't really care too much about who they are, how English they are, or how Protestant they are. Now that's something else I should point out. Don't always assume that when you've got an English tenant on a plantation estate that they are English Protestants. Because one of the secret histories of Munster in the 16th and 17th century is that many of the English settlers, new English settlers, were not They were Catholics. They're English Catholics who come to Ireland in order to escape the penal laws in England. Go away. It's the spirit of Richard Boyle after that. Right. All right. In another way, Boyle is actually a model planter, and one of the reasons why he's made Earl of Cork in 1620 is that he spends serious money on colonial defence. The original Munster plantation had been destroyed in 1598 by the Munster Rising, and after that it was a difficulty getting English people to come to Munster and settle because they were scared. Boyle defends them. Boyle, at the end of the 9 Years' War, remember, he'd been paying English captains and so on at the height of the 9 Years' War. At the end of the 9 Years' War, when the army's decommissioned, Boyle recruits a lot of the ex-servicemen as his tenants in Waterford and Cork. The rentals are extraordinary. Ensign this, corporal that, sergeant major this, captain, lieutenant, all the way down the rentals in the early 1600s and 1610s. He recruited the basis of a private army. And he had the biggest private army in Ireland after 1607, 1608. Because by law, the Irish lords were no longer allowed to maintain private soldiers. But Boyle has a private army. And the army grows and grows in size. There's a survey done in 1611, and at that stage, he has, in the region of, just short of 1,000 men in arms. Around Tallow, basically in Waterford, on the Waterford-Cork border. Subsequently, when he buys Bandon, the Bandon basically scenery and so on, he develops a second army there. And by 1622, he had 2,500 soldiers. It's extraordinary. He had more soldiers than the Crown. The Crown forces was barely 2,000 in 1622. Boyle had more people in arms. Yes, it's a militia. It's not a permanent army. It's not a 7-day-a-week army. It's a part-time army. But it's not a dad's army. These are serious guys who'd actually done serious military service in the 9 Years' War. They saw the conquest of the rebels and so on. They saw Ireland as theirs. They were the victors, and to the victors the spoils. And they become Boyle's military police as well as his tenants in Munster and Cork and so on. And they're one of the reasons why he's made an Earl. The Munster plantation is safe in the 1610s and 1620s. Much safer than Ulster. Much safer than large parts of the rest of kind of colonial Ireland. Boyle invests in that. He fits them out himself. Most of the weapons that the ordinary tenants have, the swords and the guns and the helmets and the breastplates and so on, he bought them. He has his own armament stores at Lismore Castle and later in Bandon, and he fits them out. And he has them mustered. Basically 2 or 3 times a year they're actually mustered. It's properly organised. He brings in people who actually run the sort of local militias in England to train up his tenantry. Okay, we'll move on quickly. Just those Gaelic tenants, yes. West Cork here, very busy in West Cork. It's always thought that his acquisitions in West Cork date to around 1612, the 16-teens. The work that we've been doing shows it started a lot earlier, at least in 1601, if not actually before that. The O'Crowleys, the O'Hays, the McCarthys, the O'Mahanys of Kinalmeaky. He buys a lot of land from them. Now, to buy land from the Gaelic tenants, it's often just dismissed in books as, well, the Gaelic lords were all poor, they were cash poor, it was easy to buy their land. It wasn't easy to actually buy their land. You could buy an interest in their land. It's a different thing. In the Gaelic territories in Ireland, land is held corporately by the clan, the Derafinnia, those of the blood. And it cannot be alienated. It remains part of the clan territory. Boyle is granted interests in those lands in return for money. Mortgages and pledges on land. It's a sort of mechanism to allow him to move in. But much of the Gaelic territory around Clonakilty, and the actual basis for Clonakilty itself, a place called Tawney, which actually became sort of Clonakilty, Castletown, and also all around Bandon, either side of Bandon, either side of the river. Much of the land there he buys out, beginning 1611, constantly, all the way through. Every year he's buying land in West Cork as he builds more and more territories. But in order to negotiate his way into those sort of Gaelic territories, this is what's so interesting about him as a colonist. He builds up relationships with many of the Gaelic families. He offers them loans. He brings some of the leading Gaelic families into his household and brings up their children. He hires brehons, Gaelic judges, to negotiate on his behalf. Is this what an English planter is supposed to be doing? No, it's what a landlord in Ireland is doing in order to develop his own private interests. So he's a colonist, and he appears colonial when he has to appear colonial. But at the end of the day, he's just building up a private empire. Okay, that's done luck. And yeah, we'll just go on from here. And yeah, the Colonial Militia. How am I doing for time?
Oh, sorry. I'm too busy servicing my Coke. 10:44, so...
Yeah, I'll stop now in a couple of minutes, okay. This is some of the evidence we found as well for his soldiers. There's a lot of information about the soldiers. This is a muster roll, or it's the basis for what became a muster roll, which is referred to in a subsequent document. But these are all the tenancies of Viscount Kinalmeaky, Lewis Boyle, Richard Boyle's second living son, who becomes Viscount Kinalmeaky in 1627, is it? 1628, around then. Anyway, in the National Library there's a book of the lands of Viscount Kinalmeaky, and at the start of it there's a list of all the military obligations of the tenants, and who's to support a horseman, who's to support a swordsman, who's to support a shot, and so on, and all the tenants are listed and their obligations are given, and then subsequently when you go through the book you discover evidence of the musters and who was in charge, and you know the various captains from the rent rolls who were taking charge of these particular forces, and so on. It's the basis for his armed force. Kinalmeaky is 6 pages long. The list for Boyle's eldest son, Richard Boyle, 2nd Earl of Cork, Viscount Dungarvan as he was in the 1620s and 1630s, is 14 pages long. It's in a different manuscript. 6141 I think is the one. That's 6139, National Library Manuscript 6139. And the castles, that's the other thing as well, securing the landscape. For Boyle to be secure in Ireland, he didn't just need to have his own private army to guard all of his colonial holdings. He also needed to have castles, and he had a whole ring of castles, Knockmurn here in West Cork and Ballylusky, all the way up to Galbally in East County Limerick, and then down again back to Lisfinney, Bewley, Afan, Kappa, Strancally, Ballinasray, Ardmore, Youghal. He's 2 castles in Youghal, not just one, and so on. And Lismore is just his private residence. It's fortified as well, but he has a string of castles, all guarding the rivers, the river routes, all along the river. Yeah, he's guarding that, and also, of course, guarding the coastline. So all the inlets on the coastline, he has his, they're all strategic. But also, to make that work, he needed intelligence. And that's one of the things. Boyle, as clerk at the Council of Munster back in 1600, one of his jobs has been spy master. He never lost the skills that he developed as clerk at the council. One of the most important people on Boyle's estates is a man called Peregrine Banister. And Peregrine Banister, he moves into West Cork in the 16 teens and becomes one of Boyle's main point men in the area, and works closely with the McCarthys and with the O'Mahonys and negotiates on Boyle's behalf. He's also Boyle's heavy. He makes sure that people do what they're supposed to do. But Peregrine Banister was ideal as a medium into Gaelic and Old English, native Ireland, because Peregrine Banister was a Catholic. He's an English Catholic. And he'd actually spent much of the late 1590s and early 1600s in the Low Countries in Spanish service. And one of his cousins was martyred in England in 1595. Sutherland, who's actually executed at Tyburn in 1595. Boyle recruits Banister to be his face to Catholic Munster. And Banister seems to get on very, very well. Boyle offers more and more generous terms to Banister. Boyle is not basically renowned for being a generous landlord, but some tenants he gave very generous terms to. And he gave Banister a 51-year lease, the standard lease of 21 years, a 51-year lease. It had earlier been 21, then it was 31, and then it was 51. This is all while the purchases are going on in West Cork, and also as Boyle is collecting information. Boyle is in fear of an invasion. All through the 1620s, the English crown is convinced there's going to be an invasion of Ireland, and the wild geese, the O'Neills and those from Ulster and so on, in combination with the Spanish, would invade Ireland. Boyle is the main policeman in the south. It's why he's made an Earl. It's why he's made a Privy Councillor. He is the muscle in the south of Ireland. It's the missing part of his story that people hadn't recognised before. I'm going to stop at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for a fascinating paper, and I'm sure there'll be some questions after that. Questions from the floor?
I'm just always kind of curious of this period. Listening to what you're saying, it's amazing how the business was done between, say, Boyle and O'Malley's and McCarthy's as well. That, to me, is curious because not long before that they were in rebellion, fighting each other. And then they go on. Was there a sense of nationhood yet at that stage where we have to be careful letting these English planters come in, they're going to eventually take over, or was it always... According to official Catholic sources, of course there was a sense of nationhood. But according to the evidence on the ground, it's doubtful. It depends on your own circumstances. Some of the O'Mahonys rebelled. Some of them rebelled and survived. Some of them rebelled and didn't survive. And among those who survive and among those who didn't rebel, there's a need to deal with the changed circumstances that they lost. And Boyle manipulates that. But he offers most of the Irish he does deals with, they stick with him. He doesn't dump them off the land. He doesn't rack rent them. He doesn't drive them off the land. That's a myth. He actually keeps them. Because if they're pacified, he's safe. And they'll also act to recommend other people to sell to him. He builds almost a constituency. It's based on intimidation and manipulation, but it's also, he's a businessman. Hey, what are you going to do? You know, he's a guy you can talk to. He's going to do you a deal, and all the rest, or else he's going to kill you, right? But he's one or the other, yeah. But most people do deals. Boyle is a bit of a mafioso. He's a bit of a heavy. He's a bit of a hood. Yeah? He has a private army, and he uses it to intimidate people. When he wants land and you won't sell, you get visits. People turn up, and the hedgerows tend to get trampled down. The cattle disappear overnight, things like that. And then that goes on for a year, goes on for 2 years, and then you sell. And after that, he cuts you in. So that's the sort of person we're dealing with here. Yeah? But he does leave, there's enough there. It's not an ideal set of circumstances for the Irish or for English, who he was just as ruthless with English. I mean, some of the English felt they had rights and entitlements in Cork and Waterford and the lands that they'd got from the Crown and so on. Well, if they weren't going to do a deal with Richard Boyle, those rights and entitlements were all very fine on a document, but in reality, you're going to have your hedges trampled, your cattle are going to disappear, and your buildings are going to collapse overnight. That's how it operated.
We have another question here.
Good morning, David.
How you doing?
Outstanding. And reflects the wonderful research you've done indeed with the
Thanks.
supplement. Did you come across Patrick Crosby
Oh, yeah.
in research? As you know, I've done a little book on
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
Thanks to your help.
Yeah.
Because he was very involved in consultants business as well.
He was.
And also became very wealthy. But he did some investigations. He was charged with investigating Boyle and leading to his imprisonment.
Yeah.
So does he feature quite a bit?
There's good evidence. They hated each other. Crosby is, again, a native Irish guy. McCrossan is actually his name. Padraig McCrossan. and he's from Laois. And he worked for the treasurer in Dublin, Sir Henry Wallop, who hated and despised Boyle as an upstart. And Crosby was his investigator. And Crosby is the guy who broke into Boyle's chambers in Dublin in 1595. And he took a pile of Boyle's papers about all those escheated lands and properties and so on. Well, I can tell you that most of those papers did not find their way back into the Crown's ownership. Those papers disappeared. And Patrick Crosby got rich. Yeah? And a few years later, after the Battle of Kinsale and so on, there's a sit-down between Crosby and Boyle. And Boyle had left Crosby waiting. Crosby had lost his patron when Wallop died in 1599, and Boyle's career took off. And Boyle leaves Crosby waiting until 1606. And then Crosby gives Boyle all the papers that he has about Kerry, because he clearly had taken a bunch of stuff about Kerry. And they work out an arrangement. Subsequently, a couple of years later, there's a marriage between Boyle's in-laws, his Irish in-laws. He had Irish in-laws, I haven't talked about them, and Crosby's family. But within a few years, that breaks down, because the Crosby family find that Boyle wants more than they were willing to give, and he knew they had more. So there's a lot about that. Some of it you can see stark, clear, black and white. The rest of it's impressionistic. But Crosby did a deal with Boyle, because if he didn't, he was going to be shut out forever.
You know what, I better call it a day,
Okay.
because we want to give a short comfort break to people before our next paper starts at 11, and we're getting a what happened next, so please come back to us. So if we give you 5 minutes, and thank you to our speaker.